G'day, this is Chris Savage from RL Ministries in Australia, welcoming you to this session of the book of Ezekiel. I pray that it will be of benefit to you and help you in your Christian growth. Thank you for coming along. So we're back into the book of Ezekiel. Where, as you can see there, we're only going to cover 7 verses tonight, 28 verses 13 to 19. Thanks for coming along. Now, we're still in this section where we are looking at the prophecies of judgment on the Gentile nations. We look still continuing the king of Tyre here just now. Now, before we get into that, I just want to highlight to you because we're going to see this in this section. Highlight to you that we have Satan has 6 abodes or 6 dwelling places. So we're gonna there are places where he has lived or where he's currently living and where he will live in the future. So as guardian of the throne of God, which Satan was, his first abode was at the throne of God. His second was on the earth as created in Genesis 1:1 and before his fall and the devastation of the earth in Genesis 1:2. So those 2 abodes are now historic. They're now history. He's already finished with those. We're going to be having a look at these 2 in this chapter, though. His third and present abode is the atmospheric heavens, which is the air around the earth, as we find in Ephesians chapter 2, verse 2, and Ephesians 6, verse 12. Now, his last 3 abodes are still future. His 4th abode will be the earth itself, to which he'll be completely confined for the second half of the tribulation for 3.5 years. We can check that out in Revelation 12, verses 17 to 14. His 5th abode will be the abyss, which is that section of Sheol or Hades, which is a place of temporary confinement for fallen angels. Now, Satan, we know, will be confined there for a period of 1,000 years of the Messianic kingdom, according to Revelation chapter 20, verses 1 to 3. Then his 6th and final abode will be in the lake of fire, according to Revelation 20, verses 7 to 10. So, and this will be his eternal abode, which will begin once the kingdom period is over with. Okay, now, we're up to verse 13, the second abode. Verse 13 here which was the earth as it was originally created in Genesis 1:1 and before his fall, the results of which we see in Genesis 1:2. Now, several statements here are made about this in verse 13. He says, you were in Eden, the garden of God. Now, this Eden is not the same Eden as Genesis chapter 2 and 3. The Eden of Genesis is a vegetable garden, but this one in Ezekiel 28:13 is a mineral garden. What this verse is really describing for us is what this planet first looked like when it was originally created. There were no oceans or seas. Rather, what it was a mineral earth completely covered by these various precious stones, which we're going to see in verse 13 here. So Satan was in Eden, the garden of God, but the Eden here is that second abode, the earth as it was originally created. Because when God created the heavens and the earth, he placed different portions of the universe under the authority of different angelic beings. When God created the planet Earth, he gave the authority over it to Satan, and so it then served as his second abode. Now, the second statement in verse 13 is, every precious stone was your covering. A Hebrew word, which is makuka, means a canopy, right? So the picture here is of these precious stones serving as a canopy over this king of Tyre. Remember, the king of Tyre is actually Satan. And these stones also covered the earth. So altogether, they seem to have served a double purpose. First, they covered the king of Tyre as a canopy, which is the point of verse 12. Second, they also covered the earth of Genesis 1, verse 1. So the king of Tyre, which is Satan, could walk up and down in the midst of the stones of fire. This is the emphasis which is going to be given to us in verse 14. Next, Ezekiel gives us the specific stones involved, and what we have are 3 sets of 3 plus 1. So we have 10. So 3 sets of 3, giving us a total of 9, are all precious stones. However, gold is not a stone, it's a precious metal. So that's number 10. The way we can tell that there are 3 sets of 3 is that the Hebrew word for and, which means, Chris and Lisa, only comes at the beginning of the 1st, the 4th, and the 7th stone. So it reads sardius, topaz, and diamond, beryl, onyx, and jasper, sapphire, emerald, and carbuncle, and then gold. So we have 3 sets of 3 stones plus 1 metal divided by the Hebrew word wab, which means and. Or, okay, was it Bav? Yeah, one of them. Anyway, now, incidentally, well, not incidentally, but in reality, a lot of these stones are similar to those stones which were worn by the high priest on his breastplate. He wore 12 stones set in 4 rows of 3. What we have here largely corresponds to 3 of those 4 rows. The first set in verse 13 is sardius, topaz, and diamond. Now, these correspond to the first row of the high priest mentioned in Exodus 28:17. So with the exception that the word diamond, as we have here, is mentioned on the high priest's first row set as being a carbuncle. Second set is beryl, onyx, and jasper, and these correspond to the 4th row of the breastplate in Exodus 28:20, where all 3 stones are the same. The third set is sapphire, emerald, and carbuncle, which correspond to the 2nd row of the high priest's breastplate in Exodus 28:18, with the exception that in the place of carbuncle, there was diamond in the Exodus account. So in the first and last set of stones, the diamond and carbuncle were switched in position when comparing what Satan had and what the high priest wore. This is the only variation. Then came the 10th element, which was gold, which is a precious metal. So in these 3 sets of 3 stones, with the exception of the inversion of the diamond and the carbuncle, we have almost an identical pattern of the 4 rows of 3 stones on the breastplate of the Jewish high priest in Exodus 28, verses 17 to 20. Now, for the king of Tyre, or Satan, which we saw in the last session, these stones served as a canopy, whereas they served as a breastplate for the high priest. So the indication here is that the king of Tyre may have had some priestly functions in heaven. The job of the priest on earth is to represent man to God, and this may imply that one of the functions of Satan, as represented by these stones, was to represent all the other angelic beings before God. This is only an implication, of course, based upon the comparison of the stones, because it's not certain that that was really part of his function. Next statement about Satan in verse 13 is the workmanship of your tabrets and of your pipes was in you. Now, Hebrew word translated here as tabrets and pipes might mean 2 different things. On the one hand, they may refer to the musical instruments which these English translations suggest. If they do refer to real musical instruments, then it also implies that the king of Tyre, or Satan, was the leader of the worship of God in heaven, as well as being a priestly representative. But a second possibility is that this verse should be translated as of your settings and of your sockets. Well, then this verse would refer to the settings of the gemstones, which have just been mentioned. So it could mean either. However, the actual meaning of the Hebrew words does tend to indicate musical instruments, but contextually, it may have the meaning of sockets and settings. Now, Dr. Fruchtenbaum's own view is that we should just take the words literally and keep it to musical instruments. Then, whereas there may be some question as to whether or not Satan had some priestly function, it would be clear that he would be the one who would lead in the worship of God in heaven. That would have been his role. Now, if we remember, the high priest of the Old Testament law not only had the priestly function of representing man to God, but he was also the leader in the divine worship of the God of Israel. That was his role as well. So if we were to put all of this together, this verse may be saying both things about Satan, that he was the priestly representative of God, to God of other angelic beings, and that he also led them in worship. Now, the fourth statement made in verse 13 is, in the day that you were created, they were prepared. So the first part of this statement now shows that this angelic being was a created being. So why is it highlighted? Because it shows that we're not dealing with someone who was born, but who was created. For that reason, the king of Tyre cannot be a mere human being as the prince of Tyre was, but rather he's a created being, which of course Satan was. So this is describing Satan prior to his fall. The expression, they were prepared, emphasizes that from the moment of his creation, everything mentioned in verses 12 to 13 was assigned to him. And that included, first of all, perfection in wisdom and beauty, which was from our last session. Second, the canopy of precious stones. And third, the musical instruments to be used in the leading of worship of the God of heaven. Now, then in verse 14, we read of his position during both his first and second dwelling places or second abodes. We're going to understand this better as we break each one of these statements down and just expand on them. Basically, this describes his position in both of his first two words. He was the anointed cherub that covers. So the first thing we learn from this statement is that Satan was a cherub. Now, cherubs are the highest order of created beings. We have the animal kingdom, then above that we have humanity, above them we have angelic beings, but there is an order of hierarchy even among the angelic beings. Above man we have the angels, above angels we have seraphim, and above seraphim we have cherubim, who are the highest order of created beings. So we know that when Satan was created, he was created in that highest order of beings as a cherub. Now, earlier on, as we were studying the book of Ezekiel, you might remember, it was quite a while ago, you may remember that the cherubs were the bearers of the Shekinah glory. Only the highest order of beings were allowed to have that position of being the bearers of the very throne of God. Satan, we now learn, was that type of being. So not only was he a cherub, however, he was the anointed cherub. And the Hebrew word here for anointed here is the same Hebrew word for which we get our word Messiah. So by calling him the anointed cherub, it means he is the Messiahed cherub. The picture is this. Although when Satan was originally created, he was of the highest order, he was simply just one of many of the cherubs. Therefore, he was just one among countless equals. But at a certain point in eternity past, God took this particular cherub and he anointed him or Messiahed him, which gave him a position of authority superior to all the other cherubs. That means he became the arch cherub, as we know that Michael is the archangel. So just as you have one angel with authority over all the other angels, in this same sense, Satan was the one in authority over all the other cherubs. He was the arch cherub. Now, there's probably an arch seraph, but the Bible doesn't tell us that. But there probably is one. Now, the third thing we learned from this statement is that he was the anointed cherub that covers. Now, Hebrew word for covers here means he was a covering roof, right? So the precious stones of verse 13 served as a canopy over Satan, who then served personally as a canopy over God. He was the Messiahed cherub who was a canopy over God. Now, Back in the first couple of chapters of Ezekiel, we had a description of the cherubs surrounding the throne of God. In chapter 1, we learned how these cherubs were around and under the Shekinah glory. They're around and under the very throne of God. But when it came to this particular cherub, at one time, he was not just one of those cherubs under the throne or one of those cherubs around the throne. He was a one cherub who was over the throne of God. He served as a canopy over the throne of God. He was God's covering, if you like. So what did that do? Well, that made him the most prominent cherub of them all, because it would have made him the most visible. So he had this supremely unique position given to him by God out of pure grace. Now, the second statement we see is in verse 14. It says here, I set you so that you were upon or over the holy mountain of God. So what we have here, this is a description of Satan's first abode after he was created. The expression, I set you, refers to a position given by God as a gift. It was a tremendous gift because he was set in this unique position over the holy mountain of God. Now, the word holy emphasizes the nature of the place. It's a very holy place. And then we come to the word mountain. Now, with the consistency of biblical symbolism, we know that whenever the word mountain is used symbolically, it always refers to a king, a kingdom, or a throne. So this whole phrase here indicates that Satan was set over the holy throne of God. He was the anointed cherub that covers. He was like a cherubic canopy over the very holy throne of God, where God himself was sitting. So all of this goes back to the description we were given of the whole throne and the cherubic scene with the Shekinah glory back in chapter 1, verses 4 to 28. Verses 26 and 28 especially gave us a description of the throne of God, and there were cherubs around it and underneath it. And sometime before his fall, Satan was like a cherubic canopy over that very same throne. However, he no longer has that position because he fell. It's very interesting to note, though, that no other cherub has ever replaced him. Well, the Bible doesn't say anything about anyone else replacing him. So we do not read in chapter 1 of any cherub serving as a canopy over the throne. But before Satan's fall, that is exactly what his position was in his first abode. It was a position of unique and immense authority, which also meant he had control of whom else among the other angelic beings would have access to God and who would not. The third statement in this verse 14 here is this: you have walked up and down in the midst of the stones of fire. So here we have a restatement of his second abode. Those stones not only served as a canopy over Satan, which is what verse 13 emphasized, but now we see in verse 14, we also learn that these stones were what covered the earth before Satan fell. It was his prerogative as the one who had the authority over planet Earth to walk up and down in the midst of the stones of fire. The Hebrew word here, hithalike, means to walk up and down and to and fro. Now, this is a very common figure in Scripture, which is used of satanic activity. For instance, check out when God speaks to Satan in Job 1, verse 7, and again in Job 2, verse 2. And God asks him, where have you been? He explains that he has been walking up and down and going to and fro in the earth. Same Hebrew word is used in that passage as we have here. So the whole concept of walking up and down and going to and fro typifies angelic activity. We see this, for example, in Zechariah 1, 10 to 11 and Zechariah 6, verse 7, where we have the angels of God walking up and down to and fro, making sure that God's will is accomplished in this earth. We also read in the Gospels of angels going up and down or ascending and descending upon the Son of Man. So when Ezekiel talks about Satan walking up and down in the midst of the stones of fire, this is what he was doing on earth before his fall. And apparently from Job 1:7 and Job 2:2, his activity is still to walk to and fro throughout the entire earth. But of course, this is no longer in the midst of the precious stones. And the phrase stones of fire, then it's a description of the original mineral earth of Genesis 1:1 that served as Satan's second abode at that time. Now, these stones of fire are those 10 stones listed in verse 13. Or there's 9 stones listed in verse 13. And now we come to verse 15, where we're going to read about his perfection. The first statement is, you were perfect in your ways. And the Hebrew word here for perfect emphasizes that Satan was created without any flaws. So the expression in thy ways emphasizes the fact that his actions were as perfect as his being. He was flawless in his being and perfect in his activity for a specific but unknown duration of time. We don't know how long it lasted. The second statement is from the day that you were created. So for the second time, we're now told by Ezekiel that this king of Tyre is a created being. And for that reason, he must be distinguished from that guy we saw back earlier on, Ithabal II, who was a prince of Tyre who had been born of a human mother. He wasn't created. And now it goes on to say that he was perfect from the day. And this shows that what happened to Satan later did not lie with God, because he was created perfect. Because from the very day that he was created perfect in his being, and the evidence of this was seen in the fact that all his actions and ways were also perfect. So he was created perfect, all his actions reflected this perfection of his person. Now the corruption of his person and consequently his actions came subsequent to his creation. So the fault did not lie with Creator God, right? Third statement is until unrighteousness was found in you. Now, this is the closest the Bible ever comes to giving us the origin of sin. One day after Satan had been perfect in his person and in his actions from his creation, at some point, unrighteousness was now found in him. And the word until shows that this unrighteousness was not there at the time of his creation, but rather it was found in him subsequent to his creation. And the Hebrew word avel for unrighteousness means wrongdoing. So the perfection of his ways or deeds gave way to imperfection and wrongdoing. Now, the fact that his actions suddenly became wrong presupposes a corruption of his person and character. Corruption of his personal character and his wrongdoing, we're going to see in verses 16 to 19. So at his creation and for an unknown time after, Satan was seen to be perfect in person and character. And because of this, all his activities were also perfect until something irregular was found in him. One day, there it was. And that last statement in verse 50, now we're going to look at the transition to the next passage in verses 16 to 19, which deal with the fall of the king of Tyre or Satan. So up to now, things have been great. But suddenly, with this last line here, unrighteousness was now found in Satan. Wrongdoing was now found in Satan. And now we're going to tell you why and what the unrighteousness now entailed. In the first part of verse 16, we have a description of his wrongdoing in 3 statements. First, by the abundance of your traffic. Now, this business of abundance of traffic. Now, Ezekiel has already talked about when he was dealing with the city of Tyre back in chapter 27, and also with the prince of Tyre in the first 10 verses of chapter 28. Now, for the city and the prince of Tyre, abundance of traffic meant going from port to port, gathering wealth. We see that back in verse 5, for example. But now for the king of Tyre, this meant going from angel to angel, slandering God. This is how this phrase should be understood. Satan went about from angel to angel, telling them bad things about God in an attempt to win their loyalty to himself. Now remember, he was the arch cherub. He was the top of the pile. Now, according to Revelation 12:4, he eventually convinced 1/3 of the entire angelic host. Now, this has to do with Revelation 12, but whenever the word star is used symbolically, remember, stars in scripture, it is always a symbol of an angel. And we read in that verse how Satan drew 1/3 of the stars of heaven, which would make it 1/3 of all the angels in heaven. Now, it's based upon this verse that we learn what is meant by John chapter 8, verse 44, where Satan is called the father of lies. He was the first liar because he went about spreading lies about God among the angels, and so he became the father of lies. Second statement made in verse 16 is they filled the midst of you with violence. They filled is in the plural, which refers back to the trafficking from angel to angel, right? It was this that filled Satan with violence. Violence in heaven itself, for Satan now led a revolt against God's authority in heaven. And in this manner, he began the angelic conflict, which has continued to the present day. It's going to continue now onto the middle of the tribulation, when the angels under Michael will finally be able to defeat the angels under Satan, and will defeat Satan according to Revelation chapter 12, verses 7 to 12. The third statement here is, you have sinned, and the Hebrew word shatah for sin means to miss the mark. So as a result of his wrongdoing, Satan missed the mark of his high calling. And in this way, he now became the first sinner. The first sinner, therefore, was not Adam or Eve. They were the first sinners among humanity. The first sinner of all was actually Satan. In the second part of verse 16, we're told about the judgment of the king of Tyre, or Satan. Therefore, because of the first part of verse 16, I have cast you as profane out of the mountain of God. Now, Ezekiel talks about two things in connection with this judgment. And this expression here refers to the lost position of his first abode as the anointed cherub that covereth over the very holy mountain or throne of God. And then what we're going to see also is that this perfect cherub had now become the profane cherub, and so could no longer be the guardian of God's throne, nor the canopy over it. So he lost his position in his first abode. Secondly, he says, I have destroyed you, O covering cherub, from the midst of the stones of fire. So this statement refers to the loss of his position in his second abode. So he lost all authority over planet Earth. And it was during his period of authority over the earth that he also served in his priestly role and his function as leader of the musical worship in heaven. Now he lost his priestly function and leadership of the divine worship in heaven. Now the word we see there, destroyed, I've destroyed you. The word destroyed in that statement does not mean that he was destroyed in his being, but destroyed out of the mineral garden of Eden, in the midst of the stones of fire. And so his authority over this planet was now lost. Now, it's all back. Now, because of this particular judgment in relation to his lost authority over the earth, Dr. Fruchtenbaum thinks that is why we find the chaotic state of things in Genesis 1:2, which can read, and the earth became desolate and waste, and darkness was upon the face of the deep. So suddenly, this beautiful mineral earth was covered by the oceans, and its precious stones were no longer visible. Now, what is clear is that Genesis 1:2 describes a state of chaos. Now, the whole issue that this boils down to is this. Did God originally create the earth in a chaotic state and then bring order to it? Or was it created perfect and then it became chaotic later? Well, because of statements which we find in Isaiah 45 and 48, among other passages, Dr. Fruchtenbaum cannot accept the concept that God originally created the earth in a chaotic state. Now, just Isaiah 45:18 says, for thus says Jehovah that created the heavens, the God that formed the earth and made it, that established it and created it, not a waste, that formed it to be inhabited. I am Jehovah, and there's none else. That which God creates, he creates perfectly. Just as he created Satan perfect in the beginning in this passage, but then later Satan became corrupt. So it's most likely this is what happened to the earth. Now, Dr. Fruchtenbaum thinks we need to see a gap of time between Genesis 1, verse 1 and Genesis 1, verse 2. And that is where Satan ruled the earth for a while. And then he fell as a result of the judgment spelled out in verse 16. And the earth, which was a special domain of his second abode, was suddenly covered by the oceans of the seas in judgment. In fact, and the words which are used in Genesis 1, verse 2, such as tohu vav vohu, are very frequently used by the prophets, Isaiah 34:11, for instance, Isaiah 34:11, and Jeremiah 4:23, as terms of divine judgment. So a judgment is what is being described in Genesis 1, verse 2. Although Dr. Fruchtenbaum does believe there's a gap of time between the first two verses of Genesis 1, he clarifies one thing very clearly. He does not believe there's a time gap between verses 1 and 2 for the reason that most people have put a gap there. This has been used primarily for dinosaur space. This became a very convenient place to dump all the scientific theories of geological ages and so on. So as a result, those who believe in a gap theory merely to accommodate theories of science have been forced to make that gap extend over millions or even billions of years. But Dr. Fruchtenbaum believes that the gap is there because of the fall of Satan and for no other reason. Romans 5 makes it very clear that there could be no death in the earth until after the fall of Adam. Death therefore entered into world history only through Adam's fall. So the gap need not be very long at all. And it's there only for the fall of Satan. In subsequent verses in Genesis 1, some of the effects of Satan's fall are removed. Dry land appears as God fashions the earth anew to make it habitable for a new race of beings, which is mankind, through whom and to whom God intends to give the authority over this planet. But the full effect of Satan's fall have not been removed because most of this world's surface is still covered by the waters of the oceans and the seas. In fact, the full effect of Satan's fall will not be removed until the last two chapters of Revelation. In describing the creation of the new heavens and the new earth in Revelation chapters 21 and 22 after the millennial kingdom and after the annihilation of the present solar systems, we're told that the new earth will have no oceans and seas, but it's going to be covered by the same kinds of precious stones which were listed in verse 13 of Ezekiel 28. The point here is that the new earth will look like this present earth first looked when it was first created. Although God did give the authority of this planet over to man, Satan is able to usurp this authority from man since man fell to Satan's temptation. And as a result, Satan still remains the prince of this world, according to John 12:31, and the God of this age in 2 Corinthians 4, verse 4. So that's the prince of this world, John 12:31, and the God of this age in 2 Corinthians 4, verse 4. It is certainly not rightfully his, but only because he usurped it from Adam. So Satan's rightful authority over this planet ceased when he fell and was destroyed from the midst of the stones of fire. Now, in the first part of verse 17, we have the corruption of his being. Earlier in the chapter, we had the corruption of his actions in his unrighteous deeds, which were the result of the corruption of his personal character. And that's what the first part of verse 17 is now dealing with. And two main statements are made here. First of all, he says, your heart was lifted up because of your beauty. Now, Satan began to look upon his own beauty in a wrong manner. He began to meditate wrongfully upon his beauty, and this allowed pride to set in. So just as Ithabal II, who was the prince of Tyre, would do much later, the king of Tyre did many centuries earlier. He concentrated on his own beauty and pride corrupted him. So while the first sinner was Satan, the first sin was a sin of pride. As this sin of pride led the prince of Tyre, which was the human prince of Tyre, to a self-declaration of deity according to Isaiah 14:14, Satan did the same. What did he do? He declared in that passage, Isaiah 14:14, he says, I will make myself like the Most High. Now, the second statement here is, you have corrupted your wisdom by reason of your brightness. So his beauty was his brightness, and this was wrongly viewed and led to pride, which was the first sin. And then this sin corrupted his perfect wisdom, which was noted back in verse 12. Now, the incredible wisdom he had will be used for sinful purposes. But because his wisdom has now been corrupted, to some degree, he's no longer able to think correctly. So in regard to prophecy and to the future of Satan, the question is often asked, if Satan knows the Bible and knows what's going to happen, why is he still trying to fight against it all? The answer could be right here. Although his wisdom was so great, it has been corrupted by sin, and to some degree, he feels that he can still win. Again, we still don't actually know where the origin of sin is, but we do know that the first sin was pride and that the first sinner was Satan. And in the second part of verse 17, we read of the punishment of the king of Tyre, and two statements are made. First, he says, I have cast you to the ground. Now, this expression could simply be a summary of the loss of his first two abodes, the first being over the throne of God, the second being over this earth. But again, Dr. Fruchtenbaum's own preference is to take the second possible meaning of the expression, which would make it a prophetic perfect. What that means is we're looking into the future and describing something in the past tense, as though it's already happened. So this would then make it refer to his casting down out of his third abode into the atmospheric heavens, into his fourth temporary abode, where he'll be confined to the earth with no access to heaven anymore for the second half of the tribulation. And this seems to be the primary meaning of the statement, I have cast you to the ground, using it as a prophetic perfect of what is yet to happen when he's cast out of the atmospheric heavens and confined to the earth. And this is going to occur in the middle of the tribulation, and Revelation 12, verses 7 to 12, tells us about this. And the second statement here is, I have laid you before kings, that they may behold you. Now, at the time when Satan fell, there were no human kings. So this statement was certainly not true back then. And so it should probably also be taken, like the previous one, as a prophetic perfect of a yet future event. Now, indeed, in his last two abodes, Satan will be viewed in astonishment by human kings. This is going to occur during his stay in his fifth abode in the abyss, where he'll be confined right through the Messianic kingdom described in Revelation 20, verses 1 to 3. And then the human kings will once again see him in his sixth abode in the lake of fire. And then he'll be visible to kings for all eternity, as described in Revelation 20, verses 7 to 10. In the first part of verse 18, we're now given the next description of his sinful deeds. And we have three statements being made here. First of all, by the multitude of your iniquities, and the Hebrew word for iniquities here means internal corruption. That one sin of pride led to a multiple corruption of his character. And the word is in the plural, iniquities, not iniquity, but iniquities. Now, the second statement is in the unrighteousness of your traffic. The Hebrew word used here for unrighteousness is different from the one used in verse 15. Here it is evel, which is the basic meaning of vain or vanity. And that certainly describes his character. It was a vanity business that he was conducting in his traffic of going from angel to angel, slandering God. So there was a vanity of unrighteousness. So the corruption of his character by sin led to deeds of corruption as well. And the next statement is, you have profaned your sanctuaries. The Hebrew word for sanctuaries here means, it's the same one used for the holy places of the tabernacle and the temple. In this case, the sanctuaries which Satan would have profaned would have been the sanctuaries or holy places in heaven. And notice that this word is in the plural, and it is your sanctuaries, plural. Again, this reemphasizes the fact that Satan must have been the one in charge of priestly functions in heaven to represent the other angels before God. And since the priest must have a tabernacle or temple to function in, Satan functioned in these heavenly tabernacles. Now, the one in which Messiah Jesus is functioning today on behalf of humanity is the one where Satan once functioned in that holy tabernacle in heaven. Now, because he was the one who functioned there at that time, they are called your sanctuaries in this verse. So the sanctuaries of the holy places in heaven were now corrupted. Indeed, Satan is guilty of corrupting heaven itself by being sinful while he was in heaven, and by performing sinful deeds in heaven, and by leading an angelic revolt in heaven. In these three ways, Satan was guilty of corrupting or profaning heaven where his sanctuaries were. And that's why heaven itself needed to be cleansed by the blood of Christ. If you ever wondered why in Hebrews 9, 23 to 26, the heavenly tabernacle needed to be cleansed by the blood of Christ, here's the answer. Satan once functioned there in his priestly capacity, and he corrupted it and profaned it by the three activities of being sinful while in heaven. And by performing sinful deeds while in heaven, and by leading a revolt against God in heaven, he corrupted these sanctuaries. And that is why, after Jesus was resurrected, he also brought his blood into the heavenly sanctuaries. Now, while the earthly tabernacle could be cleansed by the blood of animals, the one in heaven simply had to be cleansed by better blood than these animals. Now, Dr. Fruchtenbaum thinks that there's a unique correlation here between what Ezekiel 28:18 is talking about and what Hebrews chapter 9, verse 23 to 26 talks about. There was a subsequent necessity to the corrupting of the heavenly sanctuaries, and that was for them to be cleansed by the better blood of the Messiah, which we see in Hebrews 9, 23 to 26. Second part of verse 18 now describes the punishment of the sinful deeds of the first half. Notice the word therefore. It's therefore because of the events of the first part of verse 18. He now makes the following three statements. First, I have brought fire from the midst of you. Now, in verse 14, fire was that which once glorified Satan. Now it's going to be used to punish him. The ultimate fulfillment of this will be in the lake of fire. The principle here is that sin always carries within itself the seeds of its own destruction. The second statement is, it has devoured you. Again, Dr. Fruchtenbaum thinks that this should be taken as a prophetic perfect speaking of Satan's demise in the lake of fire. Third, I turned you to ashes upon the earth in the sight of all them that beheld you or behold you. Again, he'll be seen in the abyss during the kingdom period we find in Revelation 20, verses 1 to 3. And he'll be looked upon in his sixth abode in the lake of fire for all eternity in Revelation 20, verses 7 to 10. Then in verse 19, we're now given the results of Satan's fall. Three statements are now made. First, all they that know you among the people shall be astonished at you. So those that know him will include the 1/3 of the angelic host which he deceived, and also the many followers he has amongst humanity, and they'll be astonished at him at his demise. Second, you'll become a terror. Now, Hebrew word here, Malachim, is plural, so this should be translated terrors. It's a plural of intensity. The emphasis is therefore on the intensity of terror. And the reason why Satan has become an intense terror to others as a result of his demise in the lake of fire is basically this. If their leader finds his demise in the lake of fire, what possible hope do his followers have of escaping that same terror, the lake of fire? And the third statement here is, he says, you shall never more have any being. Literally, the Hebrew reads, thou shalt never be any more. So we know that he'll always exist in his being forever and ever, but he'll be in the lake of fire forever and ever. So that statement means that he'll no longer be active. He'll have no further activity whatsoever other than to be tormented day and night forever and ever. So these verses describe the fall of Satan and have given us a lot of details that the Old Testament had not previously revealed. And that will be as far as we'll do tonight. We'll continue in the next session looking at at Sidon, the Gentile nation of Sidon. Thank you for coming along. Study hard and grow strong.